Have you ever wondered how cultural institutions get commandeered, captured by their enemies, hollowed out, and worn like a skin suit? This episode is for you. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk, and this was going to be a book review of a book called Shepherds for Sale by Megan Basham, which came out last week to much what's the opposite of acclaim? Consternation. A lot of consternation. And I think that this book is a great book. It's worth reviewing, but I kind of want to back up and just talk about how people get bought. How institutions get taken over. I think that is a really important thing to talk about. And this book is great if you want to know about some of these specific institutions, how it was that they were captured, or at the very least, heavily swayed. Shepherds for Sale talks about how some specific institutions and organizations in the Christian space have been co-opted by others. Denominations, churches, publications, individual spokesmen and theologians, that kind of thing. Now, that may not interest you because you're not in that Christian space, but this is a fantastic book for describing the process, how it is that stuff gets taken over and compromised. So whether or not you care about those institutions, you got to realize that some people do. Evangelicals make up a gigantic voting bloc in the United States. And so the same people who might want to, take over media institutions, academic institutions, political power institutions might just be interested in the evangelical church and all of its other sort of apparatuses. So the short book review is that I highly recommend the book. And it's very important for anyone that wants to see how these particular groups were co-opted, and it's well written, it's well laid out, and most importantly, it's well documented, which we will get into a little bit later. But let's talk about compromising institutions or people. So this is something that isn't really that mysterious if you go back and you read intelligence and surveillance and spy books. If you read spy books, this idea of turning enemy agents to your side is very much talked about. Having double agents and triple agents and secret moles and things like this is just like the basic bread and butter of the Cold War. And so a lot of stuff has been written on this. And generally, people use an acronym that is for specific things. MICE, money. Money is a great way to turn an agent, just bribing them. Buying stuff from them is great. Ideological levers are the other ones. If you find somebody on the other side who has an ideological sympathy for your side, you play on that and you bring them over to your side. The third is compromise, which I think would be a little bit better served as blackmail because it involves specifically blackmailing somebody and using the threat of exposing them to bring them over to your side. But often it involves actively compromising them. The Soviets ran a bunch of honeypot agents, and people would actively try to corrupt other agents, create blackmail material about them, and then use that for control. So compromise is what it is traditionally called because it makes an MICE acronym that spells mice, so that's nice. And then E is ego. It's very easy to play on the prideful person's ego and say that you will receive more recognition, more appreciation, possibly even more public praise if you switch sides. This is probably better for like defectors because they want public praise. But even those people who want appreciation, they want private appreciation, they want to be valued for the work that they do. Their ego needs stroking. Being told that the other side will appreciate them more can be extremely effective. And those are the four that I read about over and over and over again in sort of Cold War era books. But the new brand or the new generation, the new era of intelligence adds a fifth one, a fifth lever for flipping people to the other side, and that is revenge. And I don't think that revenge is a new concept. I'm pretty sure it goes way, way back to early human times. But I do think the reason that it developed into something that needs its own mention today is that people are more bitter in the age of the internet, and it's not just two sides, America and Russia. There's a lot more going on in the culture wars today, and so revenge that you want to take for real or imagined slights is a powerful lever for a lot of people that have grown up on the internet, and I think that absolutely merits its own particular mention. So remember those 5, and I think I'll say compromise as blackmail. I think that is a little bit more effective since we're talking about compromising people and institutions. When you go from being an American agent working for the CIA to selling secrets to the KGB, that's a pretty binary thing, obviously. When in the culture wars, you become a little more sympathetic to another side and you slightly shift your tone, you slightly shift your messaging, that is a lot less obvious, this subtlety. When you demand nuance around things that aren't actually nuanced, or you try to destroy nuance and context and perspective in places where there should actually be some of those things, it isn't obvious that you've switched sides. You're not necessarily proclaiming yourself to be a KGB asset, but you are moving the flow of information in a different direction, and you are trying to control the narrative. That is a pretty big deal. Now, getting back to the book, Shepherds for Sale, there's a whole bunch of people in this book who claim that they have not moved. They have not been captured, bought, ideologically compromised, blackmailed. Their ego certainly hasn't been affected, and they certainly don't want revenge, so this doesn't apply to them. And yet they've been so very loud about this book that I would say that it's not entirely convincing, not for everybody. So I think that the response to the release of this book, which was, when you're watching this, it'll be a Tuesday. I think it came out last Tuesday. So it's been out for a week. And the furor around this book, the incredibly offended defensiveness is highly notable. And there are some specific people that are called out in this book that I am going to mention just so we can talk about them again. Tim Keller is one. The late Tim Keller, who had a church up in New York, but more importantly, was associated with the Gospel Coalition, a website that wrote a lot of articles. Marvin Olasky was the editor of World Magazine. World Magazine is a great example of something where the tone and the culture of the publication shifted. And it's worth noting that this author, Megan Basham, used to work for World Magazine. And as the magazine moved, it kind of left her behind. I think that may have been some of the reason why she got into some of this research. She wanted to know what was causing that move. And she went and, did actual journalism, which is pretty rare these days. Russell Moore is an important one. He used to run the ERLC, that's the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. But he now is the editor of Christianity Today. And then another one is David French, a pastor in the PCA, who has moved from National Review, a fairly conservative magazine, to the New York Times, which is not a very conservative newspaper. And it is these movements from one political position to another or one particular cultural flavor to another that is being documented in this book, and the why. And most of the thing that Megan Basham is focusing on is that money angle. And the reason for that is that's something that can be documented. People's ideological or ego or not always blackmail, desire for revenge. These things are hard to find receipts for, but political donations, charitable contributions are things that are easy to find and easy to track. And what the book shows is that at roughly the same time that a bunch of these folks started to move in a particular direction, they started to get lots and lots of money from people who were already in that other direction. There's about 50 pages worth of end notes, just lots and lots of documentation of some of this financial research, and she separates it into different categories. So we've got chapters on climate change, how the church changed its position on climate change. I guess not any specific church, but some of these larger interchurch organizations, and where the money came from right before that move started. Illegal immigration is another one. You guys have probably heard of the EIT, the Evangelical immigration table. Well, a whole bunch of different groups are a part of that, but most of the money is actually coming from one of George Soros's organizations. Now, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist who sees George Soros behind everything, but if you go through this book, George Soros has a whole bunch of different foundations that contribute to pretty hardcore liberal causes and a whole bunch of conservative Christian organizations. That in and of itself is the sort of thing that merits more research, and that is the research that is in this book. Chapter 3 is the pro-life movement and the way that that has changed, and I have seen that change pretty up close in my lifetime. When I was a kid, my dad did a lot of work for National Right to Life, and it used to be a very different organization than it is today. And after Roe v. Wade was overturned, a whole bunch of pro-life people were hideously, horribly, incredibly offended that Donald Trump's appointed judges would do that. And that is just a very odd sentiment coming from the pro-life crowd. And you might ask yourself, how did their priorities change? That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 talks about Christian media and the money men. There are some pretty large and influential Christian publications that have changed quite a bit. Now, this is the one where I probably take a little bit of a different tack than Megan Basham, but she also, that being said, is better suited to talk about some of these different media entities because she has worked for them and has a little bit more inside baseball than I do. But this is kind of a tricky one because it is very easy for you and a bunch of friends to believe passionately in something and create a website, a blog, a YouTube channel, a podcast, or a magazine where you write about the things that you care the most about. And if you care about these things and you understand them because you are pastors or you have some other day job that gives you unique insight into the gun industry or whatever, people will find your content interesting and they will find your convictions inspiring and they will follow you. And then you will grow this thing and you'll want to hire some new writers. And it's very hard to find people that have your unique convictions and experiences. And, it is those unique convictions and experiences that make whatever it is that you are creating particularly interesting and differentiates itself from the others. So you start to hire people and it's hard to find people like that. So you hire professional writers to write about your stuff that you care about. And over time, stuff just kind of gradually moves. We've seen that happen across a huge number of publications. National Geographic used to be an amazing journal of explorers, people who were building hot air balloons, helium balloons to go higher than humans had ever been, bathyspheres to go deep, deep under the ocean. The people doing the exploring, the people who were on the frontiers were writing the articles and documenting their experiences. And over time, guys like that were in pretty short supply. And so National Geographic hired professional writers who didn't have any experiences, didn't have any convictions. The only thing they brought to the table was good spelling and grammar, I guess. And so that's why National Geographic is terrible today. So there are honest ways where you could see a shift from good content to bad content without George Soros or other people getting involved. But those professional writers that come out of liberal universities that have been captured by guys like George Soros are going to have this bent, and they're going to bring it with them, kind of honestly, into the institution that you created to do the opposite of that. So that's chapter 4. Chapter 5 talks about COVID-19 propaganda, and that is a really fascinating one. This is another chapter where I wish there were a little bit more exploration into Canada and some of the stuff that happened up there. But if you recall, back in 2020, the government grabbed a huge amount of authority over areas that it previously did not control. And some of the few people who pushed back were churches. But there were also a whole bunch of people who were cheerleaders for the government, cheerleaders for Fauci, cheerleaders for Francis Collins, who was Fauci's boss at the time. And that is just a strange thing for a church or a political lobbying group that works for a denomination, for example, to do. It would be a strange thing for a Christian magazine to suddenly champion the very government institutions that are shutting down churches and taking a lot of control over people's lives, shutting down businesses and really harming people. And all of this is done, of course, in the name of loving one's neighbor. keeping people healthy is loving one's neighbor. And so shutting down businesses, shutting down churches is the way to go. And this is another one where Megan Basham has some very interesting personal experience where she was going to interview Francis Collins. And right at the last minute, he canceled the interview. Francis Collins is a big government institutional health guy who has, I think, some really horrific bioethical failures to his name. But nevertheless, he was propped up by a lot of Christian media as being the perfect example of someone who would help us love our neighbors in avoiding this particular pandemic. And he did not want to take this interview with Megan Basham because of some of the other things that she had written. And the argument was that he wanted, as a Christian, gracious dialogue. Now, I also want gracious dialogue. I would like to, at this point, say that I am going to be way more gracious in this podcast episode than I feel like being. I am in favor of gracious dialogue. However, running away from interviews that ask tricky questions is not gracious dialogue. That is cowardice. And so there's some fascinating things that happened in the Christian community amongst churches during COVID. It was a place where there was a lot of, I would say, winnowing that happened. A lot of churches refused to obey certain commands from the government, and as a result, they got persecution. In Canada, there were churches that were being shut down. There were pastors that were being arrested. There were helicopters flying around hunting for churches that might be meeting outdoors, can you imagine, on a Sunday because their buildings had been padlocked, surrounded, and were being surveilled by Mounties. And this is a really fascinating thing. This is a place where the church absolutely should be doing hard thinking, but also be willing to take hard stands. And running away from any level of contention in the name of graciousness, I think, is a massive failure. And churches that abandoned pastors who had been locked up for acting according to their consciences and acting according to their interpretations of Scripture is also horrific cowardice. And then there's another thing that's happening now. The churches that stayed open, particularly in Canada, attracted large amounts of the congregations of the churches that stayed closed. Christians who wanted to meet with other Christians on Sunday obviously searched for churches that were still open. And cowardly churches that closed down and refused to make statements about various things lost a lot of their people. They kind of lost their best people, and they're pretty sour about it now. So there's a gentleman in Canada named Joe Boot. I have tremendous respect for him as a theologian, but also as a brave man. And he is hated by wimpy churches who shut down and blame him for the large chunks of their congregations that they lost to the churches that followed his lead and bravely stayed open. So that is a fascinating chapter. I wish there were more of it in there. That could be a book all on its own. There's also in chapter 6 conversation on critical race theory. And that's an interesting one because it talks a little bit about Voddie Baucham. Voddie Baucham is a pastor who's actually a friend of mine. I respect him tremendously. And a few years ago, he released a book called Fault Lines, where he talked about the fact that the church in general, the Southern Baptist Convention, and a lot of these particular institutions were abandoning certain positions and taking on new positions and asking why. And that book was heavily attacked upon its release, just like this book is being attacked right now, because Voddie Baucham is apparently the wrong kind of black man to ask those sorts of questions. In the same way that Megan Basham is the wrong kind of woman to be asking questions about some stuff that happened in chapter 7, which was the Me Too movement. And inside of there is where you start to see some interesting, potential blackmail scenarios for flipping churches. And that is where you really start to see Russell Moore, who no longer is with the Southern Baptist Convention's ERLC organization. He left sort of in disgrace, but also pretending to take the moral high ground after bullying a lot of churches over allegations that were false. It was a really interesting thing to watch from the outside, and this is just a really fascinating way that you can see people jockeying for control inside of organizations. And then the final one that I think is really important to look at is the LGBTQ, the same-sex marriage and various other sexual revolutions being discussed in the church, chapter 8. And that one is one where there isn't quite as many receipts from George Soros. There's plenty. But it is the place where you can most easily see significant movement in the church. COVID-19 is kind of a new thing. The church has, in history, dealt with epidemics, has dealt with the Black Plague and various other significant actual health crises. And so it's not like it's a new thing, but churches in America generally didn't have hardcore position papers that they were writing on these things before anything happened. But when it comes to marriage and various other issues, there are pretty clear positions that churches and organizations have held to, and you can see those things moving over time. That's where it's easiest to actually see compromise occurring. So that's the book, and I think it's incredibly well laid out. I've pointed out some things that I would like to have seen more of, some things that I think are maybe not as helpful. So I would like to point out I have minor quibbles with the book, but I think it is fantastic, and my minor quibbles should in no way discourage you from buying this book if you have any interest whatsoever in these institutions, recent changes, or just kind of how bribery is done in the 21st century between large, powerful organizations. But remember that I said quibbles, because in the last week there has been a gigantic amount of press about this book, and every powerful institution hates this book, even powerful institutions that in theory have no connection whatsoever to these Christian organizations that are being criticized inside. And I find that interesting. The Wall Street Journal, for example, cannot believe that anybody would criticize Tim Keller, and that is their reason that nobody should take this book seriously. Now, Wall Street Journal does like to write about Christian scandals. So the fact that they believe that Tim Keller is one of their guys who is above criticism is, well, it's actually kind of disappointing. Then there's the New York Times. I already talked about David French, the columnist, but the New York Times hates this book. Normally, the New York Times hates books that criticize Christians. So, yeah, it's a little bit of kind of an indicator. The criticism of this book, I believe, has done more to validate the content that is inside than the copious endnotes and documentation. But there are little quibbles that people have with this book. There are people who are on an absolute rampage opposing this book. This is terrible. This is dividing the church. This is yellow journalism, and it's just the worst. But then there's also a category of reviewer who they have quibbles with the book. Minor little things. This wasn't quoted properly. This right here is from an interview that was earlier, and surely she should have gotten a later interview. It's not very nice to have an earlier interviewer, but the early interviewer was, in fact, factually quoted, and a later interview probably wasn't available to her because she's already an enemy of the right sort. So those little quibbles are being used as a way to undermine this book, to say that because there's a minor thing here or a minor thing there, the book shouldn't be trusted. The book is tainted in a way that means that nobody should listen to it or believe the copious endnotes and the hardcore documentation that is factually provable. And this is the way, by the way, that Voddie Baucham's book was treated when it came out. Fault lines that talked about race relations within the church and different organizations had exactly the same sorts of attacks. There are a bunch of people who are like, yes, but this little bit felt like plagiarism to me, so nobody buy it. Yes, but these quotation marks weren't done the way that I like, and so I couldn't tell if it was a real quote or whether it was a paraphrase. Therefore, don't trust anything in the book that could be factually provable, and by the way, mentions me. So I would say that the criticism of the book only puts it in a higher in my must-buy, must-read recommendation. But I did have, like I said, those minor quibbles of my own just to say, hey, you can criticize a book. You can criticize a pastor. You can even criticize Tim Keller and ask questions. It is okay. Nobody is above criticism or question. And I would have liked to seen a couple of things in this book that I didn't see. But all in all, it is solid, good stuff. Now, there's a guy in particular that I wasn't going to mention by name. He's mentioned in the book, but he took great personal offense to being mentioned in the book. I wasn't going to mention him, but he has been so loud about this book and in so many different, I would say, ill-advised ways that I can't really not talk about him now. So let's just mention Gavin Ortlund. As we talked about before, there's a lot of ways that people can be compromised. There is money. Bribes are very effective, and certain people are more affected by them than others. Ideological capture. This generally, I would say, happens more with people who are new to institutions and have brought some ideological weaknesses with them. Then there's the blackmail, of course. There's the ego, and then there is that revenge thing. Now, there's a bunch of people who, reading this book, believe that everything in it is about the money. And oftentimes, I would say Megan Basham doesn't really specifically explain why people are doing certain things. She does not claim to know what moved them from A to B, but she does document the checks that they received, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars from, again, institutions controlled by George Soros, not historically a friend of hardcore conservative church groups or lobby organizations. Then there are things like full-page spreads in Vanity Fair, a magazine generally not giving full-page spreads to regular small-town church pastors. These are little things that stick out and make you wonder why these particular decisions were being made and if they had anything to do with direction changes that the people receiving the checks or the people getting those large glossy photo shoots in New York City might have been affected by. But then there are people who just want the approval that comes with going along with the mainstream institutions. They don't actually get given a check. They don't actually get given a photo shoot, but they do want to kind of follow along with the people who are clearly prospering and getting invited to the White House and getting praised in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. These guys can be bought kind of for free. Actually, that's too harsh. I shouldn't categorize these guys as being bought. I would say that they have been duped. They have followed along without really paying much attention to what's going on, and they found themselves where they are. And I think that Gavin Ortlund might be one of those guys. He feels very personally attacked. To be fair, he was mentioned once, but he was mentioned as somebody who has moved in a direction, sort of gone with this particular flow, without there being evidence of giant checks. He's an example of somebody who has been sort of pulled into place rather than leading the way. But he takes this very, very personally. And at first, I said I was not going to mention him by name because I thought this is a guy who is an honest dupe. He is running a YouTube channel. He's left his position as a pastor to be a theologian on YouTube. As a guy on YouTube, I understand that there is a draw to make better content and talk about the things that people want to see and try to get your subscriber count up and your view count up. And he obviously would have gone in this particular direction if views and subscribers were what he were chasing. Could all be a perfectly honest thing. But the louder he complains about being included in this group, the more suspicious I kind of think the whole thing feels. Also, it should be noted that he is a theologian in residence with a church that is run by Russell Moore, and he's also attached to a whole bunch of other folks. So when you're in the same group that's moving in a particular direction, and you're in the same group as all the people who are complaining about how terrible the book is, and you're in the same group with a whole bunch of the people who very clearly did get checks, I think he's protesting a little bit too much. And even from a strategic position, I would say being quiet about this and hoping that it would blow over would be a much better play for him personally. So yeah, just throwing that out there. I don't really have a particular point for him, but just like, yeah, he's given a huge amount of press to this book, telling people not to buy it. He's sent a whole bunch of his viewers to Amazon to write nasty one-star reviews, even though they haven't read it yet. And in the 21st century, I think that just sells books. So I would also like to encourage you guys to potentially buy the book as well. It's a very interesting thing that we're watching. There's some old folks he's saying that, like, you throw a stone into a pack of dogs, and if you're curious which one you hit, you just listen for which one barked. There's a lot of dogs barking as this book has come out, so it's a fascinating thing to examine. Even if you don't buy the book, just keeping track of who all is mad about the book and who all says that the book is cool, but because of this little minor quibble here and this little minor quibble here, nobody should ever buy or read it. That list of people is a pretty fascinating one. So my recommendation to you is to continue to think about these things. Christians are called to be as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents. This book is full of people who appear to be the opposite. And the people complaining about this book on Twitter are kind of acting the same way. The other thing that I would point out is that the main allegation of this book is a pretty serious one, that certain Christian organizations took gigantic checks from people who were their ideological enemies on many very important core church issues. And nobody has questioned this. None of the enemies have called that into doubt. Nobody has quibbled with those allegations. It's all in how things were phrased or her interpretation of what pro-life means. And that in and of itself is another pretty heavy, I would say very damning indication of the accuracy of the book. So, this has been a relatively long episode for not actually being a book review, but it is, I think, an interesting conversation about how institutions can be commandeered and why they might be commandeered. And you will see more and more of this in the future. There are currently power struggles inside of the Democratic Party. And as you kind of unravel some threads, you can see how certain people might be manipulated by others using certain levers. And this is going to happen within institutions. This is going to happen inside of churches. This is going to happen inside of publications, universities, you name it. And I know that some of you may be wondering, how does T-Rex deal with this from its own sort of position? As we have grown as a company, we need to hire a lot of people. How is it that we are able to hire people? Are we thinking into the future when we're maybe potentially a much larger organization? How will we maintain some of our ideological positions and not be blown about by every wind of doctrine or just sort of pulled in the general direction of the culture? The good news is I think it's much easier for us to do that than, say, Christianity Today or World Magazine. We are not hiring people who have wanted to be a magazine writer their entire life, and they couldn't get into any of the real magazines, and so they have chosen a Christian one because they're the only ones that we're hiring. We attract people who want to be in the firearm industry. We attract people who want to be part of the T-Rex mission of arming people and preparing them for difficult times, giving them life-saving equipment and training information and educational content. So that, I think, helps a lot. But this is a really important thing to consider. If you do not deliberately put anchors down and hang on to them tight, there is a very strong pull in a specific direction by the culture. There is a very specific pull in a specific direction that comes from those institutions that have been captured by mainstream ideologies. So, no matter what it is that you do, I guess the main takeaway is be thinking really hard about your anchors, your standards, those things that you will not move and you will not allow other people to move for you. Thanks very much for listening to that podcast episode, which I'm not even sure how to characterize it. It was not quite a book review. It was not quite the history of how secret double agents are flipped during the Cold War and other intelligence operations. It was not quite an explanation of how the Christian community has been organized over the last 25 years. There's a little bit, maybe too much of everything and not quite enough of anything specific. So I really want your input on what more you would like to see. Would you like more basic book reviews, or would you like more overview stuff, or would you like to get deeper into specific institutions and how they have worked? Might be easier or might be more difficult, depending on what it is that you are looking for. But our goal here at T-Rex Talk is to give you what you're looking for.